gather to celebrate the visionary brilliance of our forefathers' declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It was radical, that all men are created equal. The occasion warrants reverence, but also sober reflection on the meaning of all men as it evolves. A radical reckoning began last year. I think we're all aware of that. And we are in the thick of it. Last year, Sam Chapin, turned our attention to the wisdom and travails of a foremother, Abigail Adams, whose plea to remember the ladies was spurned in Philadelphia. Then Anna Chapin mused on a paragraph deleted from the final Declaration of Independence. This passage accused King George of violating the principle of freedom by perpetuating the slave trade and by inference slavery itself. But for slaveholders, the subject was awkward. Its erasure spoke volumes. The nobility of the Declaration notwithstanding, it is now often acknowledged that our nation was built on two original sins: slavery and the dispossession and decimation of the native populations. A third, the inequality of women, was of a different and much older order. Abigail, ever gracious and diplomatic, knew the game was rigged against women, and perhaps Lin-Manuel Miranda had her in mind when he fashioned the character of Angelica in his reimagining of Hamilton. It's New York, summer 1776, and the Schuyler sisters, uptown girls, one of whom will soon marry Hamilton, are slumming it downtown, hoping to meet some young revolutionaries. Angelica's a serious blue stocking. When her sister Eliza asks, Angelica, remind me what we're looking for. Angelica says, we're looking for a mind at work, a mind at work. When Aaron Burr puts the make on her, she's unimpressed and declares, I've been reading Common Sense by Thomas Paine, so men say that I'm intense or I'm insane. You want a revolution? I want a revelation. So listen to my declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to include women in the sequel. But women, inspired and maddened by the unrealized proposition of equality, had to fight their way into the sequel. In Seneca, at the Women's Conference at Seneca Falls in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton read a declaration of sentiment modeled directly on our Declaration of Independence, but with grievances directed not at the king, but at the unjust laws of men. There's plenty of unfinished business in gender equality, but a woman of color is now vice president. Let's go on to the 27th complaint lodged against the king. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This shameful final grievance, as it has been called, was provoked by the general violence resulting from colonial invasion of native lands west of Appalachia. Slaves, it ginned up this grievance. Twin fears of rebel slaves and bloodthirsty indigents. Slaves were bolting to join the British Army, which promised them liberation in return for their fighting. Meanwhile, a confederation of several native nations had attacked new colonial settlements, and although they had British support, they were acting entirely on their own, in defense of their own lands. How dare they? Congress hoped that by fanning the flames of racism and implicating the king, they could sway public opinion in the West against the British. We know that old playbook. It's still around, inciting racism. and implicating the other. From bitter experience, Native Americans knew that colonists would not only take their lands, but kill them all. In the 7 years following independence, Continental troops and militias destroyed more than 120 indigenous communities in the Ohio Valley alone in 7 years. Many U.S. presidents, Washington, Jefferson among them, but worst of all, Andrew Jackson, would call for the displacement of Native Americans who defended their own lands. Let's bring it home to Plymouth by remembering Wampanoag elder Wamsutta James, who was invited by the town fathers in 1970 for the Thanksgiving celebration of the 350th anniversary of Plymouth Founding. It was the town's first attempt at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it had very unhappy consequences. The town fathers previewed Wamsutta James's words and promptly withdrew the invitation. They did not want to hear what he had to say. And it is a profoundly poignant speech. It is with mixed emotions, he said, that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you, celebrating an anniversary of a beginning for the white man in America. A time of looking back and reflection. It is with a heavy heart that I look back to what happened to my home. Even before the Pilgrims landed, it was common practice for explorers to capture Indians, take them to Europe, sell them as slaves for 220 shillings apiece. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod for 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn and beans. Massasoit, the great Sachem of the Wampanoag, knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers of Plymouth Plantation. This action by Massasoit was perhaps the biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. Thanksgiving Day since then, that's not the whole speech by a long shot, and I welcome you to go and look it up on the internet, or wait until Thanksgiving this year and listen to it, because every Thanksgiving Day since 1970, the Wampanoag have held their day of mourning on Thanksgiving, and it is capped by the somber reading of Wamsutta James's speech. Even last Thanksgiving, in the pouring rain, in front of Pilgrim Rock, a young Wampanoag woman read that speech. But in this year of reckoning, Plymouth Plantation has changed its name to Plymouth Patuxent. And Deborah Halland, a registered member of the Laguna Pueblo, is Secretary of the Interior, presiding over the lands that were once stolen from her people. So we have come
Excuse me. Hank has given you a preview of coming attractions, because I'm going to go back to that very famous speech that he alluded to by Frederick Douglass. But let me begin with Jefferson's commentaries on the Declaration that he almost single-handedly composed. As Jefferson penned the words, "All men are created equal," the nation was about to tear itself apart over the paradox of freedom in an age of slavery. In Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He foresaw that to keep slaves in bondage, with part of America in favor of abolition and part in favor of perpetuating slavery, this would inevitably result in civil war. I must say, if you visited Jefferson's wonderful memorial in Washington, they have those very words. I tremble for the fate of my country inscribed in that rotunda. It's extraordinary. As if in response to Jefferson's worst fears, this is what Frederick Douglass had to say in his great Independence Day speech of 1850, invoking the Declaration's principles to excoriate America for the hypocrisy of its founding. And I quote from that great speech, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than any other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." Yet Douglass also found hope in those principles. Notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. More than a century later, Martin Luther King Jr., in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered in 1963 from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, also drew upon the Declaration's promise to advance civil rights. Borrowing from Jefferson, King shared his vision for America. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Dr. King's call was answered on July 2nd, 1964, when President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Omnibus Civil Rights Act, which outlawed most acts of racial discrimination in law, if not always in practice. It seems appropriate to remind ourselves of another of Dr. King's famous sayings. "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Though we know that some awful things are happening in this country and in the world right now, we also know that some wonderful things which we never believed could happen have happened over the last 2 decades. Did we ever imagine we'd have a black president or a female vice president of African American and South Asian descent, and that the majority of Americans would be just fine with both those events? Things happen because people make them happen. As Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, once observed, "Never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has changed the world." Amen, we can say to that on this 4th of July.
Bravo.
Amen.
Amen.